diabetes is a metabolic derangement of metabolism, basically. In other words, it's very difficult to metabolize carbohydrates and proteins and fats when you have diabetes. So in essence, or in short, you're trying to utilize insulin and taking that insulin to carry carbohydrates or proteins or fat as they're converted to glucose into the cell and produce oxygen and energy, but you're unable to do so. So the body tries to compensate by finding more ways to make more glucose from protein or fat because it can't utilize carbohydrates well. And so essentially, in the end, the cells are going to be starved because they're not getting the food, the nutrients from either carbohydrates or protein or fat. And so the cells become starved, as I mentioned, dehydrated, and then there's an electrolyte imbalance that occurs. And from that, an array or a cascade of events occur that lead to a lot of what we understand as high blood sugar that occurs. Well, diabetes is known. Some of the predominant types of diabetes is obviously type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and gestational diabetes. Those are the most common types of diabetes. Type 1 is very simple. Type 1 diabetes just means you're not able to produce any insulin, and at the point that your beta cells from the pancreas stop producing, about 85% of the beta cell mass is gone, then you end up with metabolic derangement that leads to the sign of hyperglycemia. But this can happen in a very short period of time. And the body will try to find food, as I mentioned before, with diabetes. It'll try to find food in one form or another, regardless of the type of diabetes that it could be. And so it'll look to protein next because it can't utilize carbohydrates well. And so what you see, particularly in type 1, because it may be a rapid response of deterioration of the beta cell function, or it can also be a long-term response of the deterioration of the beta cell mass. But at whatever the cost may be, you end up being able to use protein, and the body will start using the protein that's in the visceral tissue or around the organs or in the muscle. And that's why you'll see that people will just lose an enormous amount of weight. And that's because they've used their protein stores that's in muscle and organ tissue in order to convert protein to glucose, which is sugar, so that you can get it into the cell to produce oxygen and energy, but it still doesn't. So type 1 diabetes, the unique part about type 1 is that it also utilizes fat. And it takes fat and converts fat into glucose eventually, but not with an array of problems. In essence, or in short, you end up with an acidotic effect when you convert fat to glucose or to food to use it as oxygen and energy. And remember, in type 1, you have no insulin being produced. In type 1, you either have to inhale it, pump it, or inject it. And so these individuals, it's almost like a cancer. They'll wither away because they have no insulin. Insulin's like a growth hormone. They call it an anabolic hormone. Without this hormone, people will die. And type 2 diabetes, a lot more complex than that, believe it or not. There's still a little bit more about type 1 that we could discuss, but in short, you're not producing insulin. You have beta cell destruction either from some pathogen or some toxic exposure, and the body got confused. It's an autoimmune response, and you end up having no beta cell mass. Type 2 diabetes could be occurring for a number of years. It's a very silent disease, and a lot of individuals have a predisposition to develop type 2 diabetes in effect because they have receptor defects and to use insulin. At the cell level, there's doors that we call receptors, and there's also receptors inside the cell to break down oxygen energy. Well, the principal part or problem with type 2 diabetes is the inability to use insulin, even though they have insulin. So the body compensates by producing 5 to 8 times more insulin. Well, during this time, they may have not decompensated yet. They might have hyperlipidemia or hypertension, that is, their lipids or their fat in their blood is high or the blood pressure is high, but their body hasn't decompensated yet. And it could take even 14 years or more. And so these individuals are gaining a lot of weight. The more insulin you produce, the more weight you gain, the hungrier you become, the more you eat, the more insulin you need to produce. And eventually your body is hypersecreting insulin to compensate for the fact that what it has doesn't work. So it decompensates eventually. But that's one of the defects. They call it insulin resistance or insulin insensitivity to your own insulin. And so you can imagine the medicine to most of type 2 diabetes is to move your muscle groups to make the insulin work more readily, to be able to utilize, to carry what normally happens with metabolism. 100% of carbohydrates converts to oxygen energy, 60% of protein and 10% of fat. So what we want is for the body to utilize carbohydrates, a little less protein, and not to really use fat. Because when you convert fat for food, it turns into acids, and the body can't tolerate that. Gestational diabetes happens during the time that someone is pregnant, so it happens to females, obviously. And it just is sort of an alert of the body that there probably was already something there, and the pregnancy just caused it to come out faster. So anytime you have a predisposition to have diabetes or a familial tendency to have diabetes, and you put yourself under a stress response of any type, which pregnancy, albeit a good stressor, or it could be a good stressor, can push you onto a diagnosis if you have a genetic predisposition to not being able to utilize insulin well, like type 2 diabetes, or you're overweight and you have a family history of diabetes, as an example. And so these women already have these characteristics of this history in their background, which puts them at greater risk. Some of which probably had type 2 diabetes undiagnosed, and when they became pregnant, they established a derangement to utilize carbohydrates and proteins and fats. The problem with gestational diabetes is now you're dealing with a fetus. Now someone with gestational diabetes has a higher risk for having birth defects, and also having maternal morbidity and mortality to occur to her. And so it's really important because we're dealing now with two individuals or more, and we have to make sure that they're in what we call a euglycemic media. That means the blood sugar's in good control, blood pressure's good control, and lipids, just like we would in type 1 and type 2. But in particular, we have even tighter control with gestational diabetes. So there's different goals that we need to have. One thing that concerns us about diabetes in general is obviously what impacts the epidemic of diabetes has always been the decreased mobility, increased processed foods. We know that technology has added a lot to that. The globalization, Americanization has added to that. And certain groups of individuals, it just doesn't do very well. Obviously, the whole country is overweight, but we don't see the derangement or the burden or the severity of the outcome with diabetes as we do with Hispanics and other minority groups such as African Americans or those of Indian admixture or American Indian admixture. And we know there's close to perhaps maybe over 45 million Hispanics in this country, and you could say on average between 8 and 10% in general probably have diabetes. And then in certain pockets of the country, certain pockets of, for example, the state of Texas, like the borders of the state, there could be as high as 50% either have diabetes or a first-degree relative of diabetes, of someone who has diabetes. And so it's something that concerns us because there have been longitudinal studies done now in the border of the state for a number of years, as in other parts of the country. But in particular, in the border of the state in Starr County,